All right, so I think since I see the attendees slowing down, I would like to get started with today's webinar. So formally welcome to our webinar today, introducing our action partner, Löning on the Prewave Action Platform. With me today is Homuth, Senior Consultant of Löning. Löning is one of our long-standing partners and internationally recognized experts on human rights due diligence, a topic that is really needed right now, and expertise is needed in this area. So we've been working with Löning for quite some time and are happy to also welcome them to the action platform. A few words in the beginning: the webinar will be recorded. You have the ability to ask questions in the Q&A section of the webinar already during the webinar. We will have an eye on it. And if a question fits, then we will ask it during the webinar. And also, of course, at the end of the webinar in the Q&A section. We will start out with a short introduction of the Prewave Action Platform, just 5 minutes. And then I will hand over to Alice to introduce Löning and the services they offer in general. And then we will dive into the services that Löning is now offering specifically on the Prewave Action Platform. We'll have a quick demo. And at the end, as I mentioned before, a Q&A session. At the end of the webinar, we will send out a follow-up mailing with both the recording and also the slides we have shown you today. And of course, the contact details of both Alice and myself, so you can follow up. So to get started, and before I hand over to Alice, let me just give you a short 5-minute introduction about the Prewave Action Platform. The Prewave Action Platform is a way we are bringing together valuable partners that are offering services to take actions with suppliers, actions to improve the capacity and maturity of those suppliers, but also your own capacity and maturity as a company, conducting human rights due diligence and supply chain risk management more broadly. These are topics like on-site audits and desk audits, trainings, consulting services, supplier engagement, all with the aim of giving our, at this point, more than 100 customers that are using Prewave for supply chain risk management, and most of them also for topics like the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, to give them a way to take coordinated and seamless action with their suppliers, which is, let's say, something that's needed for risk management and for the end-to-end due diligence and risk management processes. It's also a requirement in the various due diligence legislations that are either already passed, such as in Germany, or that are coming soon, such as the European Union CS3D. All of them have the requirement to conduct risk analysis, to identify and prioritize risks among suppliers, and to then take appropriate measures to mitigate and address those prioritized risks. And in the Prewave system, let's say this is our strength, of course, has always been to be very good at providing a structured and a seamless way to identify and prioritize risks. And now the action platform is, let's say, this missing puzzle piece in the process. We also call it the risk management cycle, in order to then address those risks and take actual steps with suppliers to mitigate those risks. And that's the action platform. An important part of the action platform, and also an important part of the due diligence cycle and risk management cycle, is that there needs to be a closed loop between identifying risks, taking action, and then having the results of those actions feeding back into the scorecards of the suppliers. There are many, let's say, ways companies can do audits and suppliers can certify themselves, and trainings can happen with suppliers. But if it doesn't feed back into the risk scorecard, it's a very hard and fragmented process to, at the end of the day, conduct impact assessments and report to authorities. And that's why the goal of the Prewave Action Platform is to provide this seamless system that combines all of these actions into one platform. And another idea of the action platform is that we want to take actions in a risk-based manner. So when we have identified risk suppliers, as we have here in this example, the first steps we typically take, and we will also touch on that in the webinar today with Löning, is we need to assess the maturity and the existing capacity of suppliers. We have here now a new functionality where we can actually, based on publicly available policies and certifications of suppliers, can do a first automated maturity assessment. We have around about a 50% success rate of suppliers having their certifications around ISO, SA 1000 and others actually published on their website. In those cases, we might not need to follow up with a self-assessment, but in many cases, we will need to follow up with a self-assessment and then continue in a risk-based manner with then follow-up actions such as trainings, worker engagement surveys, desk audits, and on-site audits. And that also brings me already to the end of the introduction. So to summarize the benefits of the Prewave platform is that we have a seamless platform to take a mix of actions from audits to trainings to desk audits to consulting to supply engagement in a system that allows you to work with specialized partners with one contract. So no need to contract with each partner individually, but to do it once through the Prewave Action Platform. And to also have in the future the ability to actually take coordinated and shared and joint action with risk suppliers. And with that, I now want to pass the ball to Alice from Löning. Again, it's a pleasure to have you. And I would like to ask you to introduce yourself and also Löning to our audience today. Hi, Alice.
Hi, good morning also from my side. Thanks a lot, Harald, for the invite. My name is Alice Homuth. I have been working as a consultant at Löning Human Rights and Responsible Business for 2.5 years now, helping companies implementing human rights due diligence and Lieferkettengesetz requirements along their supply chains, for example. I actually come from the retail sector, where I learned the trade of social compliance, as human rights due diligence was actually called back then, and data management also. And I especially learned about the importance of good software solutions to help practitioners with implementing all of these requirements. For those who don't know us as Löning, we are an international management consultancy specialized in human rights due diligence that was founded in 2014 by Markus Löning, the then Human Rights Commissioner of the German federal government. And as an international and interdisciplinary team that you can see on the next slide, we equip our clients with the knowledge, the tools, the management systems they need to effectively identify and manage human rights risks and impacts. We like to call ourselves a boutique consultancy, as we develop solutions really tailored to the client's needs, taking into account what they really already have in place without reinventing the wheel, as they say. So next to our great ever-growing team that you can see on the slide, we also work with a global network of stakeholders and partners in different countries, be it local partners for the implementation of preventive measures in sourcing countries. We've recently gone to India and Ivory Coast for projects. But we also have a network, for example, of policy insiders in Brussels or Berlin for that point. And that's why we are here today also, we don't have the software, or we don't do the software side of things, which is really why we're here today also in partnership with Prewave. Oh, Harald, we don't hear you.
So what you do provide is the expertise and the experience, and I think it's a combination of both that is needed in many projects, and we see that. So tell us a bit about the now actual services that you offer to customers and what types of customers you are serving.
Sure. So here's an overview of our client base, and you can see that we consult clients from many different sectors, from food, non-food retail, over the energy and solar panel sector, automotive, chemical industry, up to the biggest European copper smelter, for example, actually. But, and that's very important, we also work with small and medium enterprises that just fall under the Lieferkettengesetz or don't even fall under the Lieferkettengesetz. But Harald, to answer your question, in terms of services, we really help our clients with every human rights due diligence element that you can see on the next slide on our little favorite circle. So from the risk analysis over governance topics to implementing preventive measures to address the root causes of any adverse impacts on rights holders, as well as setting up grievance mechanisms and reporting. We also help with the whole policy side of things and have written human rights policy statements, supplier code of conducts, as well as other policies for companies. What is really important for us is that our work doesn't happen in a vacuum, as I said before, but that we integrate the human rights due diligence management system steps into the existing risk management systems that companies have. And yeah, so there's a lot of services that we have. As I said, on the next slide, you can see that it's the more, let's say, Lieferkettengesetz focused support on the different elements, where we also help companies with a gap assessment. So we have a look at everything they have, compared to what the requirements are, for example, of the Lieferkettengesetz, the German Due Diligence Act, and then provide a roadmap of how to continue. And on the next slide, you see all of the, let's say, complementary services that we offer, which is more, for example, legal monitoring, capacity building for your company or your suppliers, stakeholder engagement on the ground, and so on. But what is really relevant for the webinar today is that we don't not only very well understand human rights due diligence and the respective legislation, such as the German Supply Chain Act or the upcoming European legislation, but that we also understand the whole, let's say, risk analysis process, Harald, that you explained earlier in Prewave, and all of the challenges that companies face, for example, with the prioritization, and as like this prioritization after having the risk analysis is really the basis for any further action. For example, which preventive actions to choose through the Prewave Action Platform. I think that our services in the Action Platform can really help the Prewave clients then to use the system to its fullest potential. But I think we're going to talk about the actual services in a minute also.
Yeah, and I think what's really helpful is that because we have engaged on various projects and for quite some time, that Löning also has, and you, Alicia, also you have a really good understanding of how our methodology works. We have also some clients who started with an initial risk assessment from your side and moved into Prewave, and we also see this as a quite successful process where then a lot of understanding is already there. But also during the process of companies that are engaging with us first, there's a lot of points during this cycle that you showed where just certain questions arise that really go more into your expertise, and we will touch upon some of these, how we address them now on the Prewave Action Platform. But another point I think that was interesting, you mentioned it in the beginning, so you, as Löning, you also traveled on supplier side to conduct human rights impact assessments. You mentioned Ivory Coast recently. I mean, that's really a very specialized service, but an important one. Can you explain that, what it is and what your experiences are with those types of assessments?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. That there's, of course, a lot more to what we do. And we have conducted 2 human rights impact assessments in the first half of this year, where with our local partners, we had a look at the groundnut supply chain in India for one client, as well as so groundnuts are peanuts for those who didn't know, and also the cashew supply chain in Ivory Coast for another client. But we don't only do these HRIAs, as they're called, for nuts, but also a lot of other materials and manufacturing steps, actually. So that's something that we see demand rising for, because companies have now done the risk analysis, done their, like basic preventive measures, and are now really identifying some supply chains that are of high risk and high relevance to them. And they really want to do a deep dive and understand the root causes also of some of the risks that they're faced with in their supply chain. Actually, we've also, just as a side note, we've also recently launched our Learning Academy, which is not really a new service, as we've done trainings and so on for a long time now, but it bundles our training activities for companies and suppliers in a nice and accessible way, I find. And I've recently done a lot of trainings also for procurement and sustainability departments where that are working to set up their system of consequences, as we call it. And we've also worked on supplier trainings as companies now engage with their supply chain more and more. But there, if there's any more questions on the services, please visit our website or reach out to us. While we've implemented some of this, as Harald said, in the Prewave Action Platform, and you'll hear about this in a minute, we're still considering what else to include. And there's a lot more that we're dreaming to include in the future. So let us know if you have any feedback or any urgent requests or anything. Yeah.
What would be...
That was it about us.
Yeah, absolutely. No, what would be typical reasons that a customer might decide to conduct or engage you for human rights impact assessment? Is it a risk commodity? Is it recent incidents they saw? What would be the reason or the trigger point for somebody to start such a project?
Mm-hmm. So I think the whole human rights impact assessment, bubble, or this approach really comes also from civil society. A lot of retailers have started taking up human rights impact assessments to really, and that's what I was saying before, is that a lot of companies, that have quite a few years experience in classic human rights due diligence, where they have started doing sending out the requirements, doing audits maybe, and they've realized that they can't really go much further because they don't really know the supply chains in detail, also further upstream, and they haven't really understood the impacts that they themselves as the company have on these supply chains, that they've started commissioning more in-depth analysis really of the upstream supply chain also. And this actually goes a little bit further, I think, than what the German Supply Chain Act asks, but it's really what the whole human rights due diligence is moving towards, doing actually a lot more detailed assessments of very particular high-risk supply chains or materials, where then the companies want to understand what they can very concretely and in practice do for certain risks.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's also a very relevant topic, for instance, for the future European Union CS3D, where prioritizing by impact plays a much larger role and might also be related then to more upstream supply chains, where such an assessment might be a good way to actually take action and assess risks, right?
Definitely, yeah. And I mean, we can discuss then how to include these human rights impact assessments also as an action in the platform, but it will be a huge action. So we'll have to see if demand is there.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Yeah, so let's say now that we have a good overview of what learning does and what learning offers in general, let's now take a more concrete look into the services that learning offers now on the Prewave Action Platform. We've been, as I said, working with learning for quite some time, and together with Alice, we're trying to identify now a first set of services that we want to make available to you, to basically bring the learning expertise to you in a way that is most immediately helpful and relevant. And with that, I hand it over to Alice to introduce those services and dig into them.
Yep, thanks, Harald. So when you told us about the action platform, we really started thinking hard what we could offer in a more standardized manner. As being a boutique consultancy, many of our services are really tailored to the clients, and our type of consultancy is quite difficult to sell in standardized packages, I thought. But we managed, and we came up with 3 topic areas of support for now. There's hopefully more soon. And these clusters or these topic areas are made of different actions, more direct supplier-oriented actions, but also more workshop-type actions that allow us to really help the client, so you as a company, manage the preventive actions well, and also set up respective internal processes or integrating the Prewave possibilities into your existing processes. And yeah, these are like the 3 bubbles that you see here. And the first one that I'll jump into is a system of consequences workshop. So that's really part of the consulting services. I'm starting with this because over the past 10 years, we've been working with companies to decide and build a decision tree on the appropriate preventive and remedial measures for the different supplier groups. Based on the risk levels, as we've just seen in the funnel, also that Harald showed, for different risk levels and supplier groups, you need to take a decision on what to do based on the risk level, the linkage to the risk of your companies, and of course your leverage on the supplier. So to give you the option to get help on this, like how to take these decisions, you can book this introductory workshop of 1 day through the platform, where we will go through the different concepts of appropriate and effective measures. And in a more interactive part, we will then work on a first draft of such a decision tree, which you can then implement also in Prewave. So in Prewave, you can do the how, but we will help you answer more like the what question, let's say. So what are appropriate measures for your company, and how to integrate the Lieferkettengesetz criteria, for example, when onboarding new suppliers or approving new suppliers, how to roll out preventive measures as well as mitigation measures to your current suppliers, or how to deal maybe with your indirect supply chain, so meaning you're not for resale buying activities. And this workshop really is more directed to you as a company, to your CSR or sustainability or human rights colleagues, but ideally actually also to your procurement or supplier management colleagues, basically anyone in your company who's responsible for risk management, as well as managing suppliers, the contracts, onboarding process, monitoring activities, and so on. And this workshop can take place in person in a 1 day session, or 2 online sessions, depending on where you are and who needs to be trained and so on.
So for those familiar with the Prewave system, we have the action planning module with recommendations, and these work based on such a decision tree, and this decision tree can also be customized. It can be tailored to basically align with whatever comes out of these workshops. And I think it's potentially also this we see currently in discussions with customers. Sometimes it's really a specific system of consequences for specific cases, customers in certain industries, in certain areas. So I think really a beneficial way of getting started with actions also on the Prewave platform to kick it off.
Yeah, I really have to say that in my past workshops with procurement departments, it was often a challenge. As I said, not necessarily what to do, but also like how to do it and how to include these new steps into their existing processes within the company. I mean, I can leave the examples for potential questions later.
Yeah, absolutely. Question is who has responsibility to take actions. These are also questions that we are faced with, and I think it's really. And we see some customers taking different approaches. So these are I think the relevant topics to clarify at the beginning. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, that's also, in line with the German due diligence law, right? So not every company can just like follow the same path, because every company is active in a different sector, has a different size, different leverage on their supplier, a different business model, maybe a different internal setup. Is it the CSR colleagues? Is it the procurement colleagues? Is it the risk management colleagues? Is it the supplier management colleagues? Like who is responsible? Like the whole governance side of it actually is also where a lot of the challenges lie. Okay, but then let's come to the second cluster. And in this group of actions, is definitely more concrete actions directed at your suppliers that can be easily booked through the platform, namely the supplier self-assessment questionnaire. And I mean, this doesn't come as a surprise. This is a more classic preventive action that you probably all know or have heard of, that makes sense for companies who have started analyzing their suppliers, for example, with Prewave indirectly, so based on the Prewave methodology and this first scoring, but have never really been in direct contact with their suppliers maybe, and would now like to start engaging more with their suppliers. And this action can be seen as a first more concrete assessment of suppliers based on primary data and answers that the supplier gives. So this action we would recommend for suppliers with potential risks identified after having gone through the country and industry prioritization phase and the new phase that Harald just mentioned with, checking if there's already any certification or anything available. Or if you see that there's a lot of incidents at a supplier, for example, or if you have a new approval process for new suppliers from potential risk areas that you would like to assess before starting business with them. And the Löning self-assessment questionnaire for suppliers is based on Lieferkettengesetz requirements, which allows you to evaluate your business partner's management capacity for human rights and some environmental topics. And Harald, I think you also have prepared a little demo.
Yes.
Maybe we can jump into that.
Absolutely. Let's have a look at how the Löning SAQ is integrated in Prewave. I prepared a short demo around it. So the Löning SAQ is implemented as a self-assessment questionnaire in Prewave and can be used alongside the standard default questionnaires that are more simple and on a more high level. Let's say optimizing more for a fast response from the supplier, whereas the Löning Human Rights questionnaire really is more in-depth and more thorough, and asks more questions that then also make sense, that are paired then with a result validation by Löning in many cases. So how does it look like? The Löning Human Rights questionnaire is based on 6 chapters, starting with the policy commitment. And maybe Alicia, if you can quickly explain some of the structure of the questionnaire. So we see
sure.
policy commitment.
Yeah, so the questionnaire really asks about like the management system for human rights risks, as I said, and we ask about the policies, the risk analysis, the mitigation actions, as well as grievance channels, and also reporting. While, of course, Harald, you said that it's a lot more detailed than what you guys ask in general from the suppliers. It is still kept rather short, as you can see, and rather general. I mean, still focused, of course, on human rights due diligence, but we wanted for the questionnaire to be used for all kinds of sectors. So that's maybe also, good to know. And we also have 2 versions, actually. So one is for suppliers who are more agencies or importers with no actual like manufacturing processes, where we focus more with our questions on their risk management capacity in the supply chain. And here you can see this is the human rights questionnaire that Harald is sharing for manufacturers. So here we really focus on the actual like processes within the supplier and how they're dealing with their own operations. Yeah.
And the questions within this SAQ, because we just got an answer, are they specifically to the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act? Are they also applicable to maybe the CS3D, or what's the alignment here with this questionnaire?
So for now, the focus, because it's already a few months old, this questionnaire is really based on the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act and also the topics that we cover. However, as the German law and also the European upcoming legislation, they're all based on, the UNGPs and human rights due diligence elements for risk management. So, I mean, while this is really strictly focused on the German Due Diligence Act at the moment, I think it will be relatively easy to adapt it and to include a few more topic areas. For example, working hours isn't included in the German one, but will be in the European one. So we will make sure to also include them in the future to also have a more comprehensive one that you can use for both the German law and also the European upcoming law. Yeah, thanks for that question. It's very relevant. Yeah.
And so the topics covered are first the policy commitment, asking companies about policies around human rights, but also environmental aspects. And then we have as a next step the risk assessment covered. Asking companies whether they are actually actively identifying and assessing human rights risks. Also whether they're doing it just in their own operations, also for the complete supply chain. And also alongside, there's a transparent scoring system that is available and that is then used to then eventually transform it into the Prewave scorecard.
Exactly.
Then we have this chapter on prevention mitigation measures. Also, I think quite thorough on asking also specific questions around environmental topics. Then the reporting, I think this is around the public reporting companies around sustainability standards. Grievance mechanisms, also relevant to the German Supply Chain Act. And then certificates and audits, asking about certification standards and audits according to SMETA, BSCI, and for any of those, then documents and proof can be uploaded. At the end, we see a scorecard within the SAQ, but of course, an answered self-assessment questionnaire then transforms into the Prewave scorecard under the assessment score. So here we have a demo company that answered the Löning Human Rights questionnaire and received an overall score of 84 of 100 points. So they gave a good answer around showing good maturity and management capacity. So this can then be used as part of the, let's say, steps around the action platform to assess the maturity. And the result validation, which we also call desk audit internally, is then, maybe you can explain this a bit, Alice, is then from your side an additional validation or scoring of the questionnaire?
Exactly. So that's the second part of this action, or the second action of this cluster. And while we're not planning to become the next EcoVadis, as I also said on the Prewave Day, we see the need for certain validation and plausibilization of such SAQ answers that come from your suppliers. And in case the suppliers, for example, sends documents, we can do plausibility checks and validate them, and also make sure that the SAQ actually reflects the situation of the supplier. So also make sure that the answers make sense between themselves. And we can then also support you with the drafting of corrective actions or follow-up questions to your suppliers, for specific suppliers based on their answers.
Yeah. So typically what we do as Prewave is to more or less a quick check on a superficial plausibility of what is uploaded. But what we cannot do, of course, is to dig into the policies, whether they are really covering the topics, whether they are on a certain standard. And this is where Löning would come in and really in-depth check the answers and the policies provided. And of course, then to provide the service of also giving suggestions for follow-up steps based on the SSAQ results provided, which is also very relevant.
Exactly. And as the third ugly bubble on the slide, we have another consulting part. So while we also see the need of clients to derive concrete actions and next steps after receiving back the results of the SAQ. So as the third part of this cluster, we also offer a shorter workshop to jointly analyze the aggregated data and then deduce together the next steps that will make sense for the different supplier groups. So this could be asking your suppliers to improve their policies or preventive action part, but it could also be a training on what you as their client actually expect from them, or you can provide help to them on how to really set up a risk management system. And of course, for the super high risk suppliers, you can then also decide to do on-the-ground audits to really assess the situation and make sure you've fulfilled your due diligence obligations in that regard. Yeah, so to recap a little bit, you can use the SAQ to get a first impression on the theoretical management capacity of your suppliers, because whatever your suppliers tell you in a questionnaire, it's always the theory and you never know if they actually implement it on the ground, right? That's also a very important limitation of such a questionnaire. But you can still understand where potential gaps are and how far your supplier is also in understanding the questions and understanding the concepts in the questions. And we can help you then validate these answers of the suppliers to gain a more realistic impression. And lastly, we can also help you to analyze these answers on a more aggregated level and then come up with follow-up actions. I think that's a good summary.
Great. So then moving on to the next item, which I think the SAQ and the desktop validation more geared towards preventive measures and evaluating risk, but of course, part of the due diligence systems is also dealing with incidents and violations that we are noticing, or potential incidents and violation that Prewave is typically surfacing through the media monitoring that we are offering, where we are also seeing that in many cases, especially around human rights risks, when it might involve indigenous population or other topics that are simply requiring some expertise to judge them. So there we have thought about a service, expert case reviews, that I would like to hand back to you, Alicia, to explain it on a high level, and then we show some examples.
Sure. So that's the kind of like last cluster that we've come up with for now in the Prewave platform, based on, as Harald said, the very own Prewave incidents, where we offer the option of an expert case review, or an expert review of different incident cases, including a desk research on the case, and also a recommendation from our side on how to proceed. Taking an example, so there's an incident for one of your suppliers that signals a potential human rights risk, and you're unsure how to proceed. You can then book an expert case review by Löning, and we will evaluate the case based also on the so on desk research, of course, but also then against the appropriateness criteria of the Lieferkettengesetz. So how likely is the occurrence, or has something already happened? Who are the potentially affected rights holders, and what is the severity level? So how many people are affected? How bad is it? Can it ever be remediated? What is your potential link or causation as a company of the incident or to the incident? And what can be expected from you in terms of leverage, how to influence the situation? And our expert case reviews would then also include some recommendations on the next steps. And in case after this very first expert review, you would need then more help from our side, we're of course also there to support. So it's really like the beginning of a conversation. And in case your company would like to better prepare to handle these incidents also by yourself and get like a first impression of like these evaluations that we do, or reviews, and also maybe wanting to, deal with certain cases that don't only come up through the Prewave media monitoring, but also, for example, during your supplier visits or audits. We also offer a workshop here. So you see that we are trying to put our consulting work always like in workshop format. So it's like a small, well understandable scope of the consulting work. Anyway, so in this introductory workshop, we would then teach you or go through together how to evaluate these cases according to the appropriateness criteria, and how to start planning effective follow-up actions. For example, a remediation plan in line with the Lieferkettengesetz. So yeah, basically we will help you to set up remediation processes in your company to be able to deal with certain incidents also in the future. Yeah.
So to show you maybe an example of what this will look like in the future, those familiar with the Prewave system know we are a main part of what we're doing is surfacing alerts, so potential incidents at suppliers. Many of them sometimes need some additional research, digging into the sources, but even then it's oftentimes not clear, is this now really a critical issue as it relates to, for instance, the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act or not. One of these cases is, for instance, oftentimes around labor rights. So is it a labor protest really related or threatening to restriction of collective bargaining or freedom of association, or is the protest actually a positive sign of such labor rights actually being in place? This can be an area, but we have many other topics around human rights, regulations and various risks like forced labor and even health and safety or land conflict. All of these require knowledge, and this is the type of expertise that I think Alicia also mentioned, that can be part of a more in-depth human rights impact assessment. But maybe here we have a quick assessment, let's say, of the topic. So those familiar with the Prewave system, we traditionally have here in this lower part the ability to ask the supplier for a statement on the incident or the potential incident. And in the future, we now want to add also the ability to not ask the supplier, but maybe either or in addition to that, ask an expert. And in this case, for these human rights related topics, Löning will be our experts that will then help you assess. So you can send a request. The request will be forwarded to the team at Löning. And then they will provide a statement assessing the incident. If necessary, we will also, of course, bring you in touch with them directly to then have a follow-up on this matter. But this is something we are really excited about because it's something that we have been asked by customers various times over the 5 years of history at Prewave. And I think this is something with a great potential to also make the process of working with incidents more seamless for our customers. Is there anything you want to add, Alice, to this topic?
Maybe that at the moment there is a little language constraint, of course, that we can only as Löning evaluate the cases where we also have language skills for the desk review. So yeah, I mean, this is all a pilot, so we'll see a little bit how far we get, how this is actually working out, if this helps the clients, how detailed these assessments need to be so that the client can actually work with the next steps. Yeah, but we're also really excited about this because it will also help us be closer to like the everyday monitoring of companies of their supply chains. So yeah, really exciting stuff.
Absolutely. And yeah, maybe to give a quick outlook also on the timeline. So we are currently in a piloting phase. The official launch of the action platform will be with 1st of October. Until then, many of these processes will be standardized. The Löning SEQ is already available and can be used and is already be used by some of our customers. But to really engage some of the Löning consultancy services, but also the expert reviews, that will be with a target on the 1st of October. And until then, we are piloting this with existing customers. And if you're interested in also piloting or testing such a case, please feel free to reach out to us also afterwards. Do you have any outlook, Alice, you also want to share on the action platform, other ideas you might have before we jump into the Q&A section?
Yeah, definitely. And I could talk about this for a long time, but as a human rights consultancy working on pretty much all dimensions of human rights due diligence implementation, we're working on offering more actions also to you as clients or companies in Prewave. I think I mentioned this already, including trainings. Actually, we have recently launched the Löning Academy that I mentioned earlier, and would love to combine it with the Prewave Action Platform. And we also have a human rights officer training planned for October as a full-day workshop at the Löning office that maybe we can also integrate as an action, where as companies, you or as individuals working at companies, you can also learn about the theory of what it means to be a human rights officer, but most importantly, also about the practice. So we will include a lot of concrete examples on the soft skills like persistence and a high tolerance for frustration, and give some tips and tricks of what a successful human rights officer needs that no one really tells you, for example, like good networking skills and so on, but that we collected from our work over the past years. So that's something that we're very excited about, that we want to share as an action. Yeah, and also we heard now quite a few requests on the writing of human rights policies and supplier code of conducts, which we've done many times now. And I think this would also be a good action to include because it's limited in scope. It's very easy. Companies kind of like know what to expect. So we might also include this as an action, which is again, like the training and like some of the other stuff you've heard about today, is more an internal action. So it's more something that is interesting for you as a company to improve your internal processes or to step up your preventive measures, and not all of what we will offer really in the platform will be directed to suppliers. So maybe that's also a little bit of a difference of what we offer versus some other partners on the platform that really go more in the supply chain also. And yeah, I mean, we spoke about the human rights impact assessment also earlier, which would of course be amazing if we could include this. And maybe there's a little bit more interest in the next years. But yeah, I mean, let's wait and see. Maybe there are some requests coming in that from that direction.
Yeah, and what I think is also really exciting potential for the future is, of course, maybe combining a few clients with risk impacts in a certain area they share, and then doing a joint impact assessment. So this is also, of course, the idea of the action platform, to start moving away from the one-to-one relationship of one customer taking an action and then somebody else taking the same action maybe 3 months later. Have a more coordinated effort. And as more and more customers are on Prewave, we will see more and more shared risk areas where then maybe a joint impact assessment can make sense. And this is definitely something we're also thinking about.
Yeah, definitely. Duplication of measures in the supply chain is something we see and is very worrying. I mean, audits is one topic, but now also training, sending out code of conducts. A lot of the suppliers will get multiple audits and multiple code of conduct and so on. So this is really where we see also the potential for sector-wide cooperation through, initiatives, more multi-stakeholder initiatives on, the sector level, but of course also through cooperation in these kind of platforms to share whatever has already been done, with a supplier, or improvements that the supplier has implemented for another client that you can also benefit from.
Absolutely. All right, I think we have already some questions, and we will get into them in just a second. If you have other questions, feel free to post them into the Q&A section of Zoom, anything related to learning, the services we discussed, the action platform, or learning on the Prewave Action Platform. Feel free to ask them now. I will get into the first question, which is the business model or sourcing risk analysis also included? Maybe I'll give a first answer and then pass it to you, Alice, to say what Learning is doing in this area. So, of course, in Prewave, we kind of segment the approach in a risk-based funnel method, and we first start with risk analysis for the broad range of suppliers. Sometimes this risk assessment, where Prewave also engages sector risk, country risk, media screening, to assess the risk of the supplier, is already a pre-selection. So we have some customers that, for instance, worked with Learning for an initial risk assessment, and they have already a certain selection that is then put into Prewave. Other customers work with the complete supplier base in Prewave for the risk analysis, and then the handover to the action platform is whenever we have a clear picture around the risk suppliers that we then need to take or want to take follow-up actions on. But I think and maybe passing the ball to you, Alice, some of the things that Learning is really doing uniquely, for instance, is a category risk assessment, where you look at the individual sourcing categories of a company and assessing the risk of those, in addition to just a broad sector analysis, right?
Exactly. So what we do is, and this is where the boutique comes into our consultancy, is really that we take our risk data and then map it against the actual buying categories that the company uses, just to make sure that the buyers, when they see a risk score, really see the risk score for their specific supplier group, as they work with the supplier group usually, and don't see like a supplier score that doesn't really coincide with whatever they've been working with in terms of supplier groups. But I think what maybe also this question was referring to is whether in the SAQ, the business model or the sourcing strategy of a company that is being assessed is included. And so while we have included a lot of questions about the risk management in general, which then also obviously includes how the company that is being assessed deals with risks along their supply chain that maybe are due to their business model. We don't have as yet included any purchasing practices questions, just because, yeah, I think we try to keep the questionnaire also nice and short so that we actually get replies from the companies, because in our experience, it's always a trade-off between very detailed and specific questions to suppliers that then really blow up the whole, or like make the whole questionnaire a lot longer and more cumbersome, versus having shorter questions that are maybe not as detailed, but that give you a first impression of where the supplier stands without having to bother them with, you know, very long questionnaires. So we are aware of the limitations sometimes of this approach, but that's what we've experienced to be the more beneficial for both sides at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Great. Another question we have is, I think, on the customizability of the learning SAQ, and especially how the scoring for each category can vary. We have categories like labor rights, human rights, health and safety, environment. Maybe I will answer it more generally, and then you can also add to it. So generally, the scorecard in the Prewave system is customizable, and we can give customers the opportunity to put different weightings into the scorecard, depending also on their, let's say, area of business and their particular situation in their company, that they, for instance, value human rights with a higher priority than maybe they do some environmental risks. So that is generally possible. But of course, we also have the ability to customize the learning SAQ in a certain extent. Maybe you can speak a little bit about the scoring that's already in the learning SAQ. We saw it in the demo beforehand.
Mm-hmm. So where the weighting comes in for our questionnaire is really not necessarily only about the risk topics. So for example, forced labor or child labor being weighted more, but it's more about also the management system elements that are really more crucial. So, you know, if the company has a policy or not is weighted a little bit less than if the company actually has preventive measures in place to act upon any risks in their supply chain. Often, you know, one goes hand in hand, and companies who don't have policies or don't have a lot of formal commitments also are not super strong on preventive measures. However, there are companies that, you know, maybe haven't formalized everything in a policy if it's a small supplier. However, they have very strong health and safety measures. So then this would be more important for us in terms of risk management, also for you as a company to know, okay, my supplier has pretty strong preventive and mitigation actions in place, or for example, they have a grievance mechanism, but maybe they need a little bit more help on brushing up on their policies, which isn't a no-go for us. It's not a zero tolerance case. Whereas, for example, a supplier that doesn't have anything on the topic of child labor or forced labor, not a policy, not any preventive measures, nothing in place, then that would definitely be signaled as a red flag. So there are some, tools that help you to really identify what is really more important and what is a little bit less important maybe. But as Harald said, this is all also customizable, because I know some companies, for example, have the whole topic of working hours or overtime on their agenda, and others say, you know, like, well, there's not much we can do, so we would like to focus more on transparency or something. So yeah, every company has slightly different approaches. We try to really have a standard approach that is in line with the Lieferkettengesetz. But yeah, we're happy to customize also.
And I think the point you mentioned regarding the preventive measures that are really in place being valued or weighted more strongly than just having a policy that might in some cases be then just a document and maybe an empty policy if there's no measures that are really supporting it. That can be exactly one of these things that also factor into this result validation, right? That you actually look at the preventive measures a company claims they have in their self-assessment and whether they are really effective in addressing the risks that they face, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Awesome. Last question I see is, are there clearly defined auditor or assessor standards for the LKSG or human rights due diligence? Because some industries, for instance, have highly regulated standards in regards to audits. Do you know any standards or assessor criteria for audits in in these areas, Alice?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of established audit companies that have jumped on the Lieferkettengesetz train and have started also selling their Lieferkettengesetz audit protocols. So I think definitely, and I mean, a lot of them are accredited also for doing audits against more, general standards like BSCI or VDA audit standard in the automotive sector. But I mean, there's no official accreditation from the state saying, okay, this methodology and this audit criteria catalog is in line with Lieferkettengesetz. I think a lot of the auditors or like the audit companies are, coming up with their own questionnaires or audit protocols. But I think also a lot of them have a lot of experience, and the Lieferkettengesetz topics that are to be assessed in audits are not new. So whatever a lot of the, social audit sector has been auditing for the past 20 years is also basically what you need to do for Lieferkettengesetz. So nobody's reinventing anything. It's just of maybe like reformulating the questions or rearranging the audit protocols a little bit. I don't know if that actually answered the question, but I think, there's a lot of auditing experience out there. I mean, there's always the discussion of how helpful audits actually are as a preventive measures. And I think it's very important to have some quality criteria in place. For example, that it's not only an audit, but that also worker interviews have to be done and some sort of like work engagement has to take place to gain a more realistic picture. And we also all know that, for example, for topics of sexual harassment or discrimination, audits aren't very helpful because it's not the right context of asking these kind of questions and not a safe space for workers to share.
Mm-hmm. Great. So I think we're almost at the end. Just at this point, a final question came in about the kinds of clients we are working with. And I think you mentioned it already, that you're really engaging cross-sector with both enterprises and SMEs. Is there any focus areas for you, or is it really, let's say, cross-sector, cross-company size in terms of your customers you like to engage with at Löning?
I think here also the question is again, or the answer is really, because we're a boutique consultancy, we have a limited amount of services that we sell in a standardized manner. So sometimes the effort of tailoring a specific product to very small companies with a very limited budget, I have to say, is sometimes challenging. But if it's training specifically, this is something that we have offered also to a lot smaller companies. And we also work with civil society organizations or political organizations where we do small projects. Really our projects really vary from very small projects of like a day to very big projects. So overall, I can say, I mean, it's always easier to have a big client that we work with over many, many years. Obviously, that's the ideal scenario. But it's also always interesting to see how smaller companies deal with the Lieferkettengesetz and what challenges they face, because obviously it's all one ecosystem and you can't understand or consult one side if you don't understand all other sides. So that's also our aspiration really.
Yeah, maybe to answer the question from the Prewave side. So I think we engage with large enterprise customers, Volkswagen Group and Lufthansa and these types of companies, all the way down to companies that are actually, in terms of the number of employees they have, not even covered by the Supply Chain Act, but for other reasons, because they're customers, maybe they're B2C, or even they might be serving the automotive industry and they have a strong push by the customers to engage on these topics, or an intrinsic motivation to engage on these topics, which is even better.
That also exists, yeah.
Yeah, that also exists, yeah. And we have these clients. And I think the action platform, from our perspective, was really focused not on the big enterprise customers, because they oftentimes have a long history and they have their system of consequences, as Alice had the term. But let's say these small and medium-sized companies, all the way to the mid-market segment, there we really see, let's say, them being now initiated or having the first engagement with human rights due diligence and taking actions around those topics. They might have done quality audits in the past, oftentimes with internal audits, but this is now probably no longer the way forward for them to engage on human rights issues. And there we really, let's say, had the action platform in mind specifically for those type of customers. And because the business model or the pricing is driven by the number of suppliers. So for the risk analysis, it's the total number of suppliers. And for the action platform, it's the number of risk suppliers. It really scales also to, let's say, very small companies, because they just have typically less risk suppliers or less suppliers in total. So to answer the question, yes, it's really, even if you can say, focused on a mid-market to smaller company size. So yeah, with that, I want to thank everybody for participating, and especially Alice for joining me, and I think providing a very good and in-depth webinar on what learning now offers in general, and especially on the Prewave Action Platform. As we mentioned, this is really just the start, and you will probably hear from us also in this combination, probably sooner rather than later again. We will, as mentioned before, send out the recording of the webinar, as well as the slides we shared, and also the contact details of both Alice and myself, so you can follow up in case you're interested on any of the topics. So with that, I say thank you and wish you a good day, and also thank you to Alice for joining me.
Well, thanks for the invitation, Harald. It's always fun.
Definitely. All right. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.